Hello and welcome to the fourth lecture on the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. In this week, we have been talking about language. In the first lecture we have been talking about knowledge. In the first lecture, I talked about concepts and categories, and I talked about the various approaches people have taken to categorize the world into these boxes, and which helps or which warrants them a better understanding of the world. In the last lecture, we talked about particular theories which have tried to comment about how these concepts are organized in the human brain. We talked about the semantic networks theory proposed first by Collins and Quillen in 1969, and we saw that how these particular concepts are represented by nodes in this particular semantic network theory. We also saw these nodes are linked to each other by virtue of these various links, by virtue of properties they share. We also saw that each of these particular nodes carried some information about the concepts they are talking about. Say for example, if I might remind you, we were talking about concepts like canary, robin, sparrow, etc., and we were talking about the fact that canary at one level is a basic level concept. Canary is connected to a slightly more general concept, that of a bird, and a bird, at the bird node we have specified that a bird can fly, it has feathers, and at canary level we have things like canary can sing, is yellow in color, etc. We also saw that there is a more general level, that from bird you can go to animal, from animal you can go to living thing, and all of those things are arranged very neatly, very nicely into a particular network, which also represents how these concepts, or which also, let us say, gives us a good analogy of how particular concepts may be represented in our brain. Obviously there was no at the time this theory was proposed, there was no real neuroscientific evidence to support or refute this theory, but again this was a good theory to begin with and to begin talking about organization of concepts in the human brain. We saw that this theory also had some flaws to it, and that those flaws were removed in a later theory which was given by Collins and Loftus, which however although removed most of these doubts created by the earlier theory, most of the problems that the earlier theory could not handle, but in some sense that theory became too powerful to be refuted by empirical evidence, as Johnson Laird pointed out. Now, in today's lecture, we will be talking about a slightly different approach to organizing concepts or organizing these categories in the human mind. This theory is referred to as the connectionist approach to representing concepts. The majority of work, the major breakthrough or groundbreaking work in this particular regard was actually published in 1986 when the book Parallel Distributed Processing: Explorations in the Microstructure of Cognition came out. The authors were James McClelland and David Rumelhart, and they actually in some sense began what is called the connectionist approach to cognition. They have worked a lot about cognition and various aspects, but in today's lecture we will be focusing more about how these connectionist networks represent or store concepts and particular categories. Now, there are two salient features of this approach. First is based on how information is represented on the brain. This theory almost appropriates the way knowledge might actually be stored in the human brain. So, the typical neuroscientist explanation is that knowledge is not really stored at particular sites in the brain, but it might be distributed across the various neurons of the brain. The connectionist approach, or the parallel distributed processing approach, which is espoused by McClelland and Rumelhart, takes this explanation and tries to computationally model it through what is called a connectionist network. So, it basically tries to resemble as much as possible how particular concepts would have been arranged in the brain, or are probably arranged in the brain. Also, this theory can explain a wide range of findings, including how concepts are acquired, how concepts are learned, also findings about how knowledge about particular concepts might be damaged, suppose there is a brain injury, or there is some other factors that are pitching in. So, again, this is also one of the very popular, one of the very powerful theories about organization of concepts that has been around for a long time now. Now, a little bit about connectionism. Connectionism basically is an approach to create computer models for representing concepts and their properties, and it basically is based very closely to the characteristics of the human brain. So in that sense, you might say that this is more believable, and the results that the connectionist models would get might resemble in some sense as to human processing, as to how humans might be processing these concepts. Also, these models, so again, as I already mentioned, these models are called parallel distributed processing models because they propose that concepts are represented by activity that is distributed across a network. Now, this is a major change of stance from the earlier theory we were talking about yesterday. We were talking about the semantics networks theory by Collins and Quillen, wherein particular concepts were represented by particular nodes, and those nodes might be linked to each other. So canary is basically stored in as one node. In the distributed processing approach, or these models which we will talk about, concepts might be represented only as a pattern of distributed activity across a wide number of cells or a wide number of neurons. So if you can see here, this is one of the example of this connectionist theories. You can see that at the bottom there are input units, and then there are hidden units in the middle, and then there are output units at the top. So the idea is that if you have to give some stimulation, you will probably give that at the input units. Some kind of processing will happen at the hidden units, while the output units would come up with certain kind of output, a categorization task, a naming task, or something very similar to that. Now, how does this really works? These circles, as you saw here, I already told them, these are referred to as units, and these units are basically inspired by neurons found in the brain. So these lines which you see here, these lines are actually connections that transfer information from a unit to a unit, just like different neurons are connected to each other by axons. So this is one. The second is, as in the case of neurons, some units can be activated from the stimuli received by the environment, some units can be activated by the signals received from other units. Again, referring back, if you see the input units have scope of being stimulated by the environment. You might present a question, you might present a stimulus, you might show similarly a picture, a word, anything. This will cause activity in these input units. Now, after this, these input units will probably excite some of the hidden units. So you see these input units are linked with lines to all of these hidden units, and then the hidden units do some kind of processing, and then they pass on this processing to the output units. This is how this connectionist thing is working. Now, units activated by stimuli, as I have already again mentioned from the environment, are called input units. Input units send their signals to hidden units where the processing is probably going to happen, and these hidden units will send whatever the outcome of their processing is going to be to the output units. So again, just have a look at this, and it is all very simple. There are input units, there are hidden units, there are the output units. Input where information comes, information goes from the input to the hidden, and it goes from the hidden to the output unit. Now, an additional feature of the connectionist network is something called connection weights. So how strongly or weakly each of these units might be connected to each other. And these connection weights basically determine how signals from one unit either increase or decrease the activity of the next unit. So high connection weights, if two units are connected with heavy connection weights, they will result in strong tendency to excite the next unit. Lower connection weights basically will cause less excitation, and negative weights would basically lead to decrease in excitation or inhibition of the whatever activation is there at the receiving unit. Now, activation of units in this kind of a connectionist network basically then depends upon at least two things. First, the signal that is originating in the input units, the signal, a picture is shown and the picture has to be named. So whatever aspects are representing that concept in that picture, let us say a cat or a sparrow or whatever, that will excite the input units related to processing that concept, and then the further excitation will be passed on to the hidden units. Depending upon the connection weights of these different input units, information will be passed on or propagated in this network. Now, the basic principle of connectionism, if you have got the idea by now, is a stimulus is presented to the input unit, is represented by a pattern of activity that is distributed across other units. So it's not like one unit here will receive the concept of canary and the other unit will take on this activity as a whole. The idea is that whatever stimulus is presented to the input units, it will be represented by a pattern of activity, and this pattern of activity will be distributed across a variety of, or a large number of units. You can see here, this is an example of a connectionist network, and you can see here that there are concepts, there are representations. Again, you can see the representation is rather distributed, and then there are these bunches of hidden units, and hidden units are actually connected to what are called property. So there is where the processing is happening, the property units, and properties could be variety of things: living thing, plant, animal, bird, flower, is pretty, is tall, can grow, move, swim or fly, or has barks, petals, etc. And you will see properties are actually organized into is a links, is links, can links, and has links. You can see these, all of these kind of links are actually represented in the relation units. So you can probably talk about, let us say, a pine is, and then you can go to a tree, or similarly you can start from canary, can, and it can grow, fly, move, something like that. You will see the swim thing is not highlighted because canary is a bird and obviously cannot swim. Now that birds cannot swim. However, so now let us try and get our head around how is this model going to work. How are these concepts actually represented in networks such as the one we were now seeing. Now let us compare this model before actually moving here. Let us try and compare this model in its basics to the Collins and Quillen's model. The first thing you will notice, and you might have already noticed, is that both models are actually dealing with very similar concepts, concepts of objects, plants, things, etc. The properties of these concepts are indicated in both the networks, Collins network and this one, by the four relation statements, and these four relation statements are is a, is, can, and has. But whereas in the hierarchical network, which was Collins and Quillen's network, these properties are indicated at the network's nodes, and the connectionist network indicates these properties by activity that is distributed in the property units at the end. So you see is, has, etc. in the Collins and Quillen's model was actually all denoted at a particular node. So at the bird node, as I was mentioning in the beginning of this lecture, at the bird node you had has feathers, can fly, can move about, things like that. But here all of those properties are distributed at the end in the property unit. So there are many properties, and there are many relation units, at least 4 of them, and there are many concepts. So each concept via each of these relation links can be mapped onto this large array of properties that you see. So if you take into account whatever I was just describing about this model, let us try and see how a particular example would work through this network. Suppose that the input is canary and the relation statement that we are beginning with is can. So you want to basically you ask the network to fill in the blanks for this statement. A canary can, and then there is a dash. Now the dash will basically it needs to be filled. So you need to see how this network will solve this problem. Again, this is the network. You can see you start moving from canary, then you come to can, and then you can see from can it goes to let us say 4 out of 5 properties that are linked with this relation statement can. So the 4 properties are: it can grow, it can move, it can fly, it can sing, but it does not really light up, swim, because probably that is what the process and the hidden units has told us. Now the connectionist model, it proposes that a concept like canary is represented not only by the activity of property units, but also by the pattern of activation of other units within the network. So it's not only that there's only one concept in the entire network, and there are just properties associated with that concept. There are other concepts as well, and sometimes these other concepts and their processing might be able to influence the processing in this model. Say if we can participate, if you want to determine this, or if you can see, so how is this pattern going to be determined? So let us say if you can activate canary and you can activate can, and these units will send activity to the representation units and the hidden units. The effect of this activation on the rest of the network will basically depends on the connection weights between canary and can and the various units in the network. Let us try and get slightly more into this concept of connection weights. Let us say the connection weights of all of the concepts in the same network were 1, is basically 100%, everything is connected to each other and all the information is going to go to all nodes. Then what will happen is then many of the units will get activated, many of the units including many incorrect property units. If one starts at canary and has the relation statement can, it might follow all the links and it might also go to things like canary can, tall, daisy, green. Again, these are incorrect property units. That's not how the fill in the blanks will be done. So for this model to work properly, these connection weights would needs to be adjusted. So the connection weights basically determine how the output is going to be generated, and so these connection weights will have to be adjusted in such a way that when the concept unit canary and the relation unit can are activated, it only leads to these 4 units that represent what a canary can do: grow, move, fly and sing. How does this connectionist network learn to come up with this final answer? What is going to happen? What kind of learning is taking place? Let us look at that a bit more closely. Now, let us I was talking about if the connection weights were 1, everything is going to get activated and lead to so many incorrect outputs. If you have to achieve the correct connection weights, it has to happen by a process called learning. Before learning, the weights are obviously incorrect. As in our example, we showed that canary and can cause erroneous outputs like things like tall, daisy, etc. According to connectionism, now I am going to talk about how learning is going to happen. According to connectionism, these erroneous responses like the ones we just saw are noted and they are sent back through the network by a process called backpropagation. Now, what is backpropagation? Backpropagation basically is the process by which error signals, suppose this network has started learning and you are kind of repeating this process of getting an output, and you try and decide that I will keep repeating on this process till a correct output is there. So, every time an erroneous output is given, these erroneous outputs are noted down and they are sent back to the hidden units, they are sent back to the representation units with this information that this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. When this information reaches there, when information reaches the hidden and the representation units, the connection weights are adjusted. So it's almost like you want to children learn a lot by correction. So if a child kind of makes a particular mistake, you tell the child that this is not correct. The next time it's more probable than not that the child will have corrected its mistake. It's pretty much happening in the same way in this network. So the backpropagation process notes down the errors, sends it back to the hidden and sends this back to the hidden and representation units, and there basically the connection weights are now adjusted so that a correct property node will only be activated. So let us attempt to kind of again something I was saying. So consider this is an example from Goldstein. A child is watching a robin which is sitting on a tree's branch, and then just around that time a cat is coming. Now the child does not really know already that robins, because they are birds, they avoid cats because they don't want to get eaten. Now the child does not know this, and the child is kind of waiting and is kind of looking at the robin while the cat is approaching. As soon as the cat approaches the robin flies away. Now the child here who is observing this learns at least one thing. He learns that that robins do avoid cats because they don't want to be eaten. Now children do this a lot. Children learn about properties of robins from their parents as well. So this one was observation, this one was something that the child learned in action, but there are other ways also that in which children learn something. They are often told by parents or teachers or by books. Similarly, the connectionist network also begins with certain kind of weights, begins with certain incorrect connection weights. So something that is already some residual connection weights are there, some activation is there. So and these connection weights are slowly and eventually modified in response to whatever error signals are coming up. So this is how trial by trial, the network slowly learns that things that look like birds can fly, and then things that look like fish can swim, etc., etc. Now, the connectionist network's learning process therefore consists of initially weak and undifferentiated activation of property units. So, everything is getting activated. You have no idea about when the network is going to give you correct input, it will correct output, it will give so many errors, but as and when after every trial these error signals are being sent back through the network, these error signals are then leading to changes in connection weights, changes or modification in the connection weights. Every time the connection weights are adjusted so that the next trial is better, the next trial leads to less error and more correct response. So, activation of canary should lead to a different kind of an activation pattern after a particular number of trials. Now, one of the properties of the connectionist network is that changes to these connections are slightly smaller, they are not very big. It does not happen that after one trial automatically the second trial there will be almost correct output. So, these changes to these the changes to these connection weights, that is, are small after each learning experience, so that the process is repeated again and again until the network assigns the correct properties to canary. Now, although the network might not work well for canaries, it might also happen that it does not really work well for other related concepts. Suppose after a number of trials, 5,000 trials, 10,000 trials, the network can correctly identify canary and its properties. But if a robin comes and sits next to the canary, how is the network going to react to the robin? Now, to be useful, to be any useful and to be able to in some analogous way represent human conceptual organization, this network would need to be able to represent not only canaries but also robins and also other kinds of trees and animals, etc. So, to create such a network and to create a network that can represent these many different kinds of concepts, this network is not usually just trained on specific concepts like the canary or the robin or just the cat. The presentations of canary, suppose you want to teach the concept of canary, are also interleaved with other related and sometimes unrelated concepts. Canary will be also presented with robin and sparrow and parrot and maybe pine trees and other kinds of trees. And as soon as the network is learning, the network has to learn to classify each of these things correctly. So, small connection weight changes have to be made after each presentation of so many of these concepts, so that this network learns to correctly classify all of these concepts at once. Now, because the network has to now respond correctly to so many different concepts, the network's learning process has to be designed in such a way that changing the connection weights in response to, let us say, when it is learning about canary, it should not result in worse responses to, let us say, a pine tree or a robin. So, how do you ensure that the network is learning all of these concepts in a way and none of these learnings are interfering or making each other worse? This is achieved by changing the weights very slowly. On each trial, the connection weights are adjusted by a very small amount, so that then, when the responses to one concept are getting better, it will cause very little disruption to responses towards other concepts that are again being learned at the same time. Eventually, with a lot of practice, with thousands and thousands of trials, the weights in the network become adjusted such that the network can generate correct activation of property units for so many different concepts at the same time. We can appreciate, actually we can have a look at this learning process and how this learning process occurs over many trials by looking at the results of a computer simulation. The example I am going to take is one where a network was presented with a number of different concepts and relation statements one after the other, and the activation of the units and connection weights between these things were calculated by the computer. So, this is a typical example of the connectionist network, and herein is basically is happening trial after trial. So, you see at trial 0, when the number of trials is equals to 0, there is almost no difference between how the network is categorizing many different concepts like salmon and canary and daisy and rose and pine. But you see, as you go ahead in the number of trials, you go from 0 to 250 trials, there is some change. You go from 0 to 750 trials, there is some more change. By the time you reach from 0 to 2500 trials, you will see that the network has learned to classify all of these concepts separately. So, you will see there is very little similarity between how the network is dealing with cannery and how is this network dealing with salmon. So, how is this happening? At the beginning of the process, the experimenter can set up some arbitrary connection weights so that the activity was about the same in each unit. Here we are at learning trials equals to 0. This is basically what I was referring to earlier as weak and undifferentiated activation. So, anything that comes is kind of treated in pretty much the same way. As the learning progresses, with each concept being presented one after other again and again, and the computer kind of changing weights very slightly after each trial in response to error signals, by the time trial 2500 reaches, the network has learned here you can see to classify these concepts very differently and probably come up with correct classifications. Now, these connectionist networks are created by a learning process that shapes these networks so that they are eventually capable of handling a wide range of inputs. Information about each concept in a connectionist network is contained in a distributed pattern of activity across a number of units. So, you can talk about so many different birds and animals, you can talk about so many different possible relations that are there, and you can talk about so many different properties: has feather, has fur, has 4 limbs, has 2 ears, has whiskers. You can think of a large array of property units. All of these are distributed across a number of units. So, it does not have one unit or one node for a particular property or particular category. Now, as opposed to the Collins and Quillen semantic network, representation in this connectionist network is far more complex, and it involves many more units for each concept, but it is also like much more. The advantage is that it is also much more like the processing or the representation in the brain is happening. So, this is actually one of the major advantages of the connectionist network, because as we know, and if you have referred to the earlier course, we do not talk about memory, for example, or perception, for example, to be stored in a particular site in the brain. We are talking about memory as distributed across the variety of areas in the brain. Similarly, we are talking about concepts being stored across a variety of areas in the brain. Many researchers actually believe that knowledge is in these connections network really very closely reflects how the knowledge is stored in the human brain. One of the examples could be that the operation of connectionist network is never totally disrupted by damage. It basically gets disrupted very slowly. This phenomena is referred to as graceful degradation. What does graceful degradation means? Graceful degradation means that if one aspect of this connectionist network is damaged, it at once does not break down or shut down the entire system. Very slowly, gradually, part by part, node by node, the performance is degrading slowly and slowly. That is why the reference to graceful degradation. Another aspect is that connectionist networks can actually explain the generalization of learning. In this world, you do not learn about all specific animals. You don't learn about a dog and a cow and a cat separately. You learn about all of them as animals. So, because, and again, this is very similar to what is happening in these connectionist networks, because similar concepts have similar patterns. A training system which is basically learned to recognize the properties of one concept, such as a canary or a robin or a sparrow, also would be able to provide information about related concepts. Say, for example, you train the system with canary, it might be able to tell you a little bit about the sparrow as well as the robin or as well as the parrot. So, again, these two are examples in support of what the connectionist network might be talking about. This is all from me about connectionist networks. We are still talking about knowledge in this week, and I will talk about some other aspect of knowledge in the next lecture. Thank you.